All right, welcome back. Great to have you with us again. In this session, panelists will explore ways to achieve depolarization to create a more flourishing world. This panel is moderated by Heather Templeton-Dill, president of John Templeton Foundation. Now, Heather and the panelists recorded the session prior to today to accommodate schedules, but we still invite you to please use the chat box to share your reflections. We welcome them and they give meaning to our convening today. Panelists will share insights gleaned from their research and practice to lay out how we might begin to transform the power of our differences and come together to build constructive solutions for the crises we face in modern times. One critical element to achieve depolarization, we know, will be strong leadership. To set the stage for this discussion, we have a video from the Elders with an important message. You'll know that the Elders is an independent group of global leaders working together for peace, justice, human rights, and a sustainable planet. It was founded by Nelson Mandela in 2006-7 and made up of luminaries, past and living, like Jimmy Carter, Kofi Annan, the late Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, to name a few. It is now my pleasure to introduce this segment on depolarization and pluralism for human flourishing, starting with the Elders.
What if our best future still lies ahead of us?
At a time of huge uncertainty and global risk,
a brighter future can be hard to imagine.
As elders, we believe our shared humanity can shape a better world.
We face intractable crises.
We face existential threats.
But we need not face them alone.
Nor without hope.
As former world leaders, we understand the challenges of decision-making in an unpredictable world.
As human rights advocates and grassroots champions, we have fought for justice and inclusion.
As elders, we use our voice
to demand ethical leadership, promote global solutions,
and the dignity and rights
of all human beings.
Urgent action on the threats and injustices we face cannot wait.
conflict,
pandemics,
nuclear weapons,
catastrophic climate change.
These interlinked, intergenerational challenges seem insurmountable.
But our mission as elders is to take them on.
Our best future can still be ahead of us. Hope persists.
In the words of our founder, Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done.
My name is Heather Templeton-Dill. I'm president of the John Templeton Foundation. We support research and catalyze conversations that inspire people with awe and wonder. And I am delighted to moderate an important conversation about imagining a world where our societies manage conflict well, navigate differences with mutual respect, and cultivate communities that embrace pluralism. The title of this session is Depolarization and Pluralism for Human Flourishing. We have invited 3 guests who spend their days thinking about social cohesion. While their work is oriented towards solutions, how do we find ways to bridge divides, address the challenge of polarization, and leverage our individual and collective identities for the good of all? We will also take time in this session to reflect on the factors that create division in the world today. We will explore a definition of polarization to better understand depolarization. And we will focus on the concept of pluralism to ensure that we remain ever hopeful about humankind's capacity to overcome some of our greatest challenges. We begin with a reading from The Power of Us, harnessing our shared identities to improve performance, increase cooperation, and promote social harmony. This book was written by Dr. Dominic Parker and Dr. Jay Van Bavel, two social psychologists who met in grad school and formed a tight bond from a shared experience in the first days of graduate school. Dr. Jay Van Bavel joins us as one of our guests. He is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University, where he directs the Social Identity and Morality Lab. Jay, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Heather. So this is going to be my first ever book reading. I'm going to be reading a couple pages from my book, The Power of Us. And I'm reading from the very last chapter. So if you have a copy at home, you can dig into this. It's really about the future of identity. So we're facing a number of challenges. And I wanted to kind of lead off by talking about the way that the human mind is wired and maybe giving us some hope and some ways of thinking about how we can approach the future. So what we say in the book is that people coordinate and cooperate with one another much more easily when they see themselves as sharing an identity. The identities we activate and act upon are often those that differentiate us from others, whether these are based on the boundaries of our occupations, our religion, our race, gender, or nation. But we've seen tons of research showing that people can be drawn together by a common fate. And when they recognize that they share this common fate, and have a sense that they have the same destiny, this can bring us together. So in a world with nearly 8 billion people sharing this fragile rock circling the sun, facing a number of challenges like climate change that do not affect all communities equally, we all have a very clear interest in how we can save it, how we can come together to solve some of the biggest problems facing humanity. So how can we capitalize on our shared identity? How can we make it readily apparent that we share these common interests and common destinies? How can we get people to look beyond our more parochial identities that often divide us and make it hard to come together? Can recognition of our shared identity as residents of Earth help us save the world and face some of these challenges? So that sounds daunting and almost impossible, but there's reason to hope that we can even potentially do that. And no one has experienced this truly global sense of identity probably more profoundly than the astronauts who have seen the Earth from space. So on Christmas Eve of 1968, aboard the Apollo 8 spacecraft, just months before the first lunar landing, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders were doing a practice run at orbiting the moon. And as their spacecraft circled the moon, they were mesmerized by the view of its rugged, pockmarked, almost alien surface. Then suddenly Frank Borman exclaimed, "Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?" And quickly they took a photo of it. These were the very first photos showing the Earth slowly rising over the moon's horizons. These were the first humans ever to witness an Earthrise. And when they splashed down back on Earth and they brought back with them and shared these pictures, these were eventually known as and described as the most influential environmental photographs ever taken. It was known as Earthrise. In the half century since that time, hundreds of people from 38 different countries have traveled to space. And NASA interviewed a collection of these astronauts and found that many of them had undergone what they said was a truly transformative experience involving senses of wonder and awe, a unity with nature, and also a transcendence and universal sense of humanity. Although the feelings and awe of transcendence are often fleeting, the research discovered that the astronauts had undergone longer-term changes in their identity, their sense of who they were. They felt a deeper sense of connection with humanity as a whole. After they had seen the Earth from space, the significance of national boundaries that normally divide us eroded, and the conflicts that divide people on the ground seem much less important. As one astronaut put it, when you go around the Earth in an hour and a half, you begin to recognize that your identity is with that whole thing. Now, there's no way that we can send everyone into space, and maybe this is unfortunate because some of our most pressing issues, not only climate change, but also pandemics, terrorism, the potential for nuclear war, might be more easily solved if we could expand our moral circles to include much larger swaths of humanity. But research suggests that you don't have to be an astronaut to experience a common sense of human or global identity. And that when people create a more inclusive sense of their self, it's associated with more support for international cooperation, environmental protection, and all kinds of other things. And so it seems to us that these deep feelings of connection to humanity as a whole are generally too rare or too fleeting. But we need the type of leadership that can help us create senses of connection and a broader sense of identity in our own communities to overcome our more parochial or narrow interests. And so we have the capacity for this. This is what the research and lots of experiences and these stories from astronauts tell us. But our job is to find a way to create it in time. And that's, I think, the fundamental challenge facing humanity. And so with that, I turn over the rest of the panel to discuss the ways that we can do this.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Really appreciate you reading an excerpt from your book. And I want to draw on some of the themes that you've just mentioned. But let's welcome our other guests. We also have today Uma Viswanathan joining us. She is the Executive Director of New Pluralists, a collaborative of funders founded in 2021 that is focused on supporting practitioners, storytellers, researchers, and innovators to foster a culture of pluralism in America. Welcome, Uma.
Thank you.
And our last guest, Mark Freeman, is a leading expert in political transitions and high-level peace negotiations, and founder and executive director of the Institute for Integrated Transitions, which is a non-governmental organization dedicated to supporting locally led efforts to reduce polarization and break cycles of conflict or repression. Mark, welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Jay, since you started with a reading from your book, how do you define pluralism or polarization? Is polarization a helpful word as we think about conflict between individuals and communities or groups of people?
Yeah, it's a great question. So polarization has a lot of different meanings. One basic meaning is just that people disagree on political issues and policies. And I think that's healthy. It's healthy to have these debates. This is kind of like what you want in a society where people can debate differences and ideas. The type of polarization that I think is more harmful for society is what's called affective polarization, which is this is just that kind of gut feeling that you really don't like another group. And the reason, and some of this is driven by our disagreements on policy issues, but not all of it. In fact, if you really hate another group, politically or based on their ethnicity or nationality, it can make it impossible for you to reach compromise, even when you agree on policy. And so that's the type of polarization that I think is more dangerous and problematic, is just simply hating another group so much that you won't be willing to compromise on something that could benefit all of you. And so I think that is the challenge. The other part of polarization in the US and many other countries that seems problematic is that it's become increasingly connected to morality. So it's not just that you disagree on important issues, but you think the other side is evil. And if you think the other side is evil, it means that you will engage in underhanded activities to stop them. It means you won't compromise with them. It means you will vote for candidates you don't like or think are unethical or corrupt because you think that's a lesser evil than the other party taking power. And so that's we call, actually I have a paper on this, we call that political sectarianism, where it starts to look like these kind of more religious conflicts that divide countries and often can become violent and intractable. And so that's what we're tipping into in the United States and many other countries. And that I think is where it becomes toxic or dangerous and problematic for society. And so that's the type of polarization that I think that we as practitioners and scientists and scholars should really be focusing on our efforts on. We don't necessarily would never expect everybody to agree on something. And that's actually part of the beauty of humanity is our diversity and differences of opinion. It's when it reaches these other more dangerous and problematic forms.
Thank you. Mark, I want to ask you the same question. You have dedicated a good portion of your career to areas where polarization and conflict is high. How do you define polarization? How much do we know about the concept today, and how much do we have yet to learn?
Well, thank you, Heather. I was listening to Jay do the reading at the beginning, and he used the term shared identity. And I would say polarization is a reality in which shared identity is extraordinarily difficult to find. For me, I'm a bit fussy with definitions. So there's a paper that my organization published earlier this year, which is largely about trying to bring a bit more clarity to what polarization is and what it isn't. Part of where I start is just the roots of the word itself, poles. That's one part of the word. And poles are when you're talking about poles or a polarity, you're talking about distance, not proximity. That distance can take many different forms, but it's definitely an idea of distance. And another part of the word is polarize as a verb, because it's not just that there's distance. When you're talking about polarization, it's not just the absence of proximity or something shared. There's also polarized means that there's it denotes intensity. And in the way that I analyze it in the paper that we published, I think what we're talking about is radicalization. So picture, in that sense, polarized groups, polarized people, polarized actors existing at a distance. And it's a condition or a circumstance where shared identity is a remote possibility. So polarize, if shared identity is an important goal, at least as Jay has articulated it, then polarization is a very, very grave problem. So much so, we label it in our work a hyper problem, meaning that it's a special category of problem that makes the solution or resolution of all other problems harder. So all the kinds of problems that Jay also mentioned, whether it's climate change, whether it's racism, whether it's war, whatever it is, if you have polarization, the ability to solve that is infinitely harder. So it's a very serious problem. It's a hyper problem.
Thank you. We have some good words on the table: effective polarization, the concept of poles, the use of the verb polarize. Uma, do you think about polarization in your work? You're focused on building a culture of pluralism. To what extent do you think about the problem you're trying to solve? And to what extent would you call that problem polarization?
Yeah. First of all, I love both of your responses and the level of nuance that's involved with it as well. So we are a collaborative of funders who are looking to renew our faith in our ability to practice pluralism. Like, we want it to be essential to how we get things done, how we solve for all of these challenges. And the reason we exist is in part because of the level and the ways in which polarization is expressing itself in our culture. And so we see ourselves as both that polarization is a core threat to our ability to advance a culture of pluralism, but we also see ourselves as an antidote to polarization. Because I think, we are able to see the ways in which we're sort of fracturing our ability to be able to come together with that sense of shared identity, but to also have the kind of healthy conflict that is a vital part of what it means to be able to be a democracy. And I think that's that fine line that pluralism enables, is this ability to see that sense of cohesion together without erasing the differences. How do we hold those sort of higher order shared identities that allow us to not sort of tear apart at the seams, but not so that we flatten the ability to be able to truly see each other, take the kind of time that we need to be flawed, to be able to repair along the way. And the context in which we are living is making that virtually impossible. There's a degree of space, nuance, the ability to be able to forgive and be forgiven, that the ways in which we're seeing polarization play out, and frankly, the ways in which there are systems, media systems, social media systems that are actually benefiting off of this happening. And there's a sort of a system that is profiting off of this. Sometimes we think of it as like a hate industrial complex. That is what we're sort of navigating and like pushing against, is how do we challenge those incentive structures systemically and really call for something else. And so that's where it's sort of like the problem and the solution need to be, we have to give people an alternative. If we're naming the challenge of polarization, and for us, we think of pluralism as, well, here's the other way. That's the off ramp, off of the trajectory that we've been going down.
Thank you for that. And I want to turn in a moment our conversation to thinking about, well, what's the solution? What role does pluralism play in pursuing depolarization? But Jay, one more question for you about the challenge, the problem. In your work, you speak about what drives society to fracture into us and them. At the experiential level, what does polarization take away from people, and how does this pose a risk to society?
Yeah, great question. I'll try to build on Mark and Uma's answers because I thought they were excellent. So one thing that we've been studying in my lab is the impact of things like social media. And so part of the way that social media works is that the incentive structures for individuals are often to engage in more polarizing behavior. And so, for example, if people use moral emotional words, it's one thing we found. For every moral emotional word you use, like hate or contempt or disgust, your message is 15 to 20% more likely to be reshared. And so if you put a bunch of language like that in a message, it can go viral. And so you're getting rewarded. You're getting likes, followers, building clout, getting attention to whatever content you're creating. But what we found is when people use that language, it polarizes people on political discussions. And they might not see it, but the only people engaging with them are people already who agree with them. What we find is that when you see somebody using a message like that, you see them as more closed-minded, and you're less willing to engage with them if you don't agree. So for them, it's really mobilizing the base of people who agree with them, but it's not persuasive or doesn't generate engagement among people who differ from you. In fact, they see you as somebody not worth engaging with. And so the incentive structures that we've created are bad. And accelerating. This is now, we're talking about, I study this in an American context, but more and more we're doing global research. Almost 5 billion people are on social media around the world. There's lots of reason to link it to even as much as things like violence, threats to democracy, genocide. The damages seem to be most harmful of social media in existing democracies. In autocracies, it's actually really useful for people to share information and mobilize because they otherwise don't get a voice. And so it seems most corrosive into places that have established democracies. They're fragmented by this and polarized. So that's one of the scariest things, just the scale and scope of it. And it's going global, and we are barely starting to do research on it. And the incentive structures are not going away. I see my kids on social media now, and I'm trying to engage them around how to think critically about this because you just get sucked into it. The other problem with social media is, and a way it makes us vulnerable, Heather, to answer your other question, is through the spread of misinformation. So misinformation spreads further and faster and farther than true information. And what the research finds is it's because when it's on political issues, it's more likely to spread, and when it's emotionally laden. So it goes back to those kind of moral emotionals and politics and identity. That's the vectors upon which misinformation spreads. And so you might think, well, misinformation a lot of time is innocuous. But I'll give you, I just published this paper and shared it this week. I estimate, a lot of researchers are with me on this, that the estimation in the US alone from the harm of polarizing the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, was on the order of hundreds of thousands of additional deaths that were unnecessary in the US. Because trust in first of all, just belief in what the risks were for the pandemic were polarized within the first month and persisted for the last 3.5 years. And we found that the single biggest predictor across the country of vaccination rates was who you voted for. If you're in a county that voted for Trump, you were far less likely to get vaccinated than a county that voted for Biden. That was a bigger predictor than education, than socioeconomic status, than inequality, than ethnicity, than age, which was actually probably the biggest risk factor for actually getting harmed or hospitalized. So this is how we spread misinformation now. And it's damaging to the people who are exposed to it and share it. And it's part of the reason it goes viral is because of these factors, this dynamic. And it puts us at risk to foreign interference. So here's another thing. We've created a dictionary of polarizing language on social media, and we've analyzed the Russian trolls, and this is the rhetoric they use. And they use it in many countries, not just the US. And they're using more of it. Their whole goal is to divide. And so it makes you vulnerable as a country. It's like having pre-existing conditions. It makes you vulnerable to getting attacked. It makes you vulnerable to further division. And so these are just some of the things that we're seeing. And this is only in the last few years. Like, this is, in my view, not getting better. And the scale and scope of it seems to only be getting worse, and it seems to be infecting other countries now. And so I think if we don't address this root problem of polarization and the mechanisms that are driving it, whether those are psychological, technological, economic, political, we are in deep, deep trouble. So that's why, and as Mark said, it's I don't know, the term I'm used to is wicked problem, but it is a big multidimensional problem, and we need all hands on deck if we're going to solve it.
That's right. I think the framing Mark provided was hyper problem. So
yes,
if we have a hyper problem, I want to turn to you and think about, so what's the path forward? New Pluralists is predicated on a vision of healing divisions, recognizing our shared humanity, embracing differences, and solving challenges together. In your experience, what is required to build a field of leaders who can transform the vision that I just articulated into a reality? What have you learned in the work that you're doing?
Well, I think one of the most important things, and I think especially Jay, given the way that you sort of laid out the challenges that we're up against, these huge systems, these incentives, it can actually be quite overwhelming. It can actually lead to a level of paralysis, the sense of none of us are smart enough to actually be able to figure out and navigate our way forward. And I think this is where we see a number of people either becoming desensitized, numbing, escaping, driving themselves closer towards the level of mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, loneliness, because it just feels like it's too much to be able to handle this level of complexity and change. Or we find people finding someone to blame, finding some way in which we could try to control by saying, well, there's another person who's responsible for this. Let me just take them down. So in an interesting way, the ways in which we frame the challenge can actually disempower us from feeling like we can even take leadership. And so the key is to actually lay out what is this possibility that we can step into. Where do we see pockets of hope? Where do we see promise? Because with New Pluralists, we want to see a society where millions of Americans actually feel a sense of agency, that I can do something about this through the individual choices that I make as an everyday community member, as a family member, as a parent, but also as an organizational leader, to actually be able to see that there are no sectors, no industries that are exempt from this challenge, but also where everybody can enact some level of change. And so that starts with being able to actually believe in the promise of pluralism. There's something about this needing to not be a sort of, well, when we fix all the problems, then we'll figure out how to coexist peacefully together. It has to be seen as this is essential. If we're going to be able to navigate anything, whether we're talking about toxic polarization, whether we're talking about climate change, the new economy that we want to start to imagine, we actually cannot do that without each other. And that needs to become part and parcel of what it means is I'm willing to draw on perspectives that I may not agree with, because we're going to lead to better solutions. And that's going to matter for our kids and for future generations. And Jay, I want to also kind of make a nod. You're talking about those future generations. We're also discovering that being able to put the time horizon out into the future does something to kind of unlock us from the moment that we're in. And then the other piece of it is really being able to invest the kind of resources that need to happen right now. And by resources, that's financial, but it's also time, energy, kind of intellectual capital, social capital. This isn't going to just sort of happen on its own. We need to actually believe in and renew our faith in pluralism. We need to be inspired enough to actually set aside our own personal agendas and egos and feel a sense of we're all kind of in this together. We need to be able to embrace rapid learning, risk-taking, testing out new ideas. It's like we have to have enough conviction about our why, but humility about what we're actually doing. We need to be able to hold each other and say, hey, what if we try it this way? Let's try it out that way. Sometimes it might be unlikely relationships, maybe bridging across traditional divides. There's a way in which the way we solve the problem might mean we need to practice pluralism while we do it. And we also just need to be able to have space where our learning is actually tied to action. I think a lot of times, a lot of the people we work with are researchers, and we're also working with a number of practitioners. And very often there's not enough meaningful conversation and mutuality and co-design that happens. I think this is where the best of research and practice can really come together, is around this wicked challenge.
Thanks, Uma. So I'm going to come back to pluralism and actually have you define it in a moment. But let me turn to Mark now and explore the concept of depolarization. So in your publication that you referenced earlier, First Principles, you argue that depolarization requires understanding the contextual facts on the ground in addition to the fundamentals of depolarization. Why is it important to understand the contextual facts on the ground, and what is needed to design effective interventions?
Great. Thank you, Heather. I suppose I'll start with the first part of your question then about depolarization. Most of our work over the last couple of years we've done in collaboration with the Ford Foundation, and we've developed at least an indicative solution spectrum or solution set. And it consists of three main parts. This is not an exhaustive list, but the three main parts I think Jay and Uma touched upon in different ways. One part of the solution spectrum about how do you depolarize is we have as a category called outreach and dialogue. It's self-evident that you need outreach and dialogue of different kinds within in-groups and between and across different divides with out-groups, so-called. So outreach and dialogue is one part of the solution set, the solution spectrum. Another part we just call fact and narrative interventions. Again, Uma and Jay have talked about disinformation and in different ways talking about how narratives also embed how we view others, view inconvenient facts, all these sorts of things. Narratives also shape or can be determinative in our worldview. So that's a second area where depolarization work concentrates. And then thirdly is at the ecosystem level. And so there are structural reforms. It's not only, of course, when it comes to things like social media, there's a huge array of policies that can help create an ecosystem that produces, again, going back to the term Jay used at the beginning, more shared identity. There are things that you can do mechanically, legislatively, procedurally to make the ecosystem encourage, basically less polarizing attitudes and actions. The context part, which was the second part of your question, is critical as well, because even if we came up with the perfect solution set in the laboratory of our minds, this is not a math problem. This is a problem of societies, of political systems. And so it is absolutely fundamental that, as a starting point for us at least, that there's an understanding of the realities on the ground, not just in terms of the problems, but also in terms of windows of opportunity, entry points for change, leadership, etc. And just to give a simple point about the salience of context, when it comes to polarization, if a society or political system is already very polarized, if it is already severely polarized, then that means that certain kinds of interventions may not be very effective. For example, in a very polarized place, there's less openness to persuasion about alternative narratives or different facts. And so investing, for example, heavily in trying to establish the facts may not work as well if the context is already severely polarized versus a context where it is not yet that polarized. There's more openness to persuasion. That's an example of the salience of context.
So I want to go a little bit deeper on that. What is the role of the regional brain trusts that is a part of your work? What is a brain trust? And what work does it do? And what are the brain trusts designed to accomplish? So you've articulated some aspects of your work. What about that piece of the work that you're doing?
No, thank you. Well, it goes again to this idea of localization of solutions, localization of leadership. So a brain trust in our work, I mean, we're a global organization. When we think about or are invited to work in a particular context, we don't want to make existing problems worse. We want to bring a positive contribution. But our chance of doing that is much less if we are not working with a multiplicity of actors that are based in that country, that have the knowledge, the understanding, the recognized leadership, the entry points, the know-how about that particular context. So for us, again, you're absolutely right. I mean, our brain trust model links to your prior question about the priority of context as a starting point. And so our brain trusts generally are groupings of 15 or so recognized leaders from different sectors, from different disciplines, who we work together with over a very long period. And that can include on issues of polarization. We try and have these spaces operate, to use the pluralism word. I mean, our brain trusts internally are pluralistic spaces for thinking through, for strategy formation about problems, including polarization and conflict in the places that we work. And they're also structures that outwardly are pluralistic, so the members of our brain trust would be people who speak with actors from across the different divides. They should model, in other words, the kind of society or political system that they aspire to see in their particular country.
Jay, let me turn back to you now. You diagnosed some of the challenges that we faced earlier. Given what we know, how can we move towards a flourishing state where our differences and our shared identities promote cooperation and social progress? What's possible? Feel free to mention some of the challenges as well, but with a real focus on what's possible given the research you do in your lab and what you've learned along the way.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So I'm going to talk about a couple of big studies that have come out that have given me a bit of hope. And the first one is going to go right to Uma's point, which is we do need hope here. So I'll show you when you don't have hope, what happens. So we just ran this massive study, just shared it as a preprint this week and did a press release, where we tested on climate change interventions in 63 different countries. And we tested 10 interventions that were selected by leading experts to see what worked. And we looked at whether they changed beliefs, whether they changed actual behavior, whether they changed policy support. You know, Mark just pointed out how important that is. And what we found is when you use doom and gloom messages for climate change, and I see a parallel here with sharing doom and gloom messages about polarization, is that that was the single best intervention for getting people to share information online. So if you give people a doom and gloom intervention and tell them there's really no hope, that the world is burning up, they want to share that online. They want to go right to social media and share it. But it actually decreases their real behavior. They don't want to put any effort into something that will help the climate. And so we have to be very careful with doom and gloom messages because it mobilizes people to share it, because the incentive structure of social media is rewards doom and gloom. But it actually demotivates you to actually do a behavior. And so I think that's why it's important to focus on hope. And I will say climate change, here's two pieces of hope. So we looked at how polarized climate change was, and we found that it was polarized around the world. In fact, the US was the second most polarized country in the world, second only to Chile. But there were many countries that were not polarized. And so that's one thing that gave us hope. It doesn't have to be that case. It's the same thing when we looked at the pandemic. There were a lot of countries that weren't polarized at all. So there's always a possibility of exiting from this. One thing we found when we looked at climate change was that also there was no polarization when it came to effortful behavior to plant trees. So even though many Americans, for example, especially conservative Americans, don't believe in climate change, they're just as willing to put in the effort as liberals to do something about it. And so I think a big thing that told us is that if you find the right actions, in this case, it was tree planting, that you can get liberals and conservatives both on board. Conservatives are more resistant to some things, but just as on board on liberals with others. So I think that might be part of the solution, is finding where there is common ground to take action, which is actually what matters the most. And then the other thing that gives me hope is there was a recent study that was run out of Stanford University by Jan Volkel and Rob Willer, and they reached out to researchers and practitioners around the world and asked for their interventions on affective polarization. And they got 252 submissions from around the world. They picked the best 25 using a panel of experts. And they tested them with 32,000 Americans from every demographic group in the country to see what reduced polarization. And then they not only measured it, but they followed up 2 weeks later to see not only what worked in the short term, but what worked in the long term. And I'm going to toot my own horn here and go full circle, because my lab submitted an intervention based on the principles of our book about building a common identity and also underscoring the norms of democracy, which are really rooted deeply in American tradition. And what we found is that was tied for the most effective intervention out of these 252 submissions. So it does seem like there's hope if you can create a sense of shared identity, in this case as Americans, if you can reinforce that the norms are about supporting democracy, and that's the history of this identity. Because it's not just enough to get people to identify and have a common identity. You need to underscore what's important about that identity and create healthy norms. And so that was the thing that seemed to be one of the most effective strategies. The two other effective strategies that were tied with ours for most effective. One was it was a Heineken beer commercial, actually. So super high production values, millions of dollars probably went into this. But it just showed people talking and putting together a bar. And then it revealed that they differed politically. And it gave them, put two beers in the bar and said, do you want to stick around and discuss your differences? And it turned, and then of course they showed the clips where people were willing to discuss their political differences. And so that reminds me of 70 years of research on contact theory. If you have positive contact with somebody who's different, it starts to break down your stereotypes and make you more willing to engage with them, even on things you might not agree with. And then the other intervention that worked was just revealing that the media misportrays our side. And so if you reveal to conservatives that liberals understand that they're being misrepresented in the media, and if you reveal to liberals that conservatives understand that they're being misrepresented in the media, that is something that kind of gets the walls to come down a little bit, and they're more open and less polarized. And so we have to understand right now that the way that the media and social media both are often pulling people from the extremes and holding them up as if they're representative of an entire group. And that creates what's called false polarization. And it creates the false belief that the other side hates you and they're radically different from you. But these portraits don't match reality. And so if you simply show people the reality that that's actually not true, these people don't hate you that much, and they're actually not that different from you on most issues, it kind of makes people more open-minded and willing to engage. And so that is something is about, we've talked a lot about the downsides of polarization, but we have to be careful not to create false, exaggerated forms of polarization and understand that there are these grounds that people can traverse and connect on.
Well, thank you, Jay. That certainly gives a lot of hope. It's also what you've just shared reminds us of the value of research and testing our assumptions and putting some of these concepts to an experiment and seeing what we learn along the way. We have just a few minutes left, and Uma, I'm going to end with a question to you. You cast a vision for pluralism as an antidote to polarization. So building off of some of the examples that Jay just gave, what is pluralism? I think a definition would be helpful. And what is New Pluralist doing to cultivate pluralism? What have you learned in 2 or 3 years of your work?
Yeah. And I think defining pluralism can be very challenging, especially when you're trying to make it something that belongs to a lot of different people. So this is a way that we have approached it is actually through guiding principles that people can unpack for themselves. And so these principles we see exist on the level of individuals. It's actually a deeply personal process. It's a mindset that we're talking about, but exist also within relationships, as well as can be infused within organizations in the ways in which people design their own work, strategies, relationships with each other, political systems, media systems, that these principles can actually live almost at every level of an intervention. But they don't just happen on their own. It's actually something that we need to say, we want to renew this. We need this to be able to come to life in the choices that we're making again and again, the stories that we're choosing to tell as citizens, colleagues, community members, and neighbors. And so part of this has to do with the level of complexity. Again, there is no one organization, there's no one approach, there's no one solution that's going to be able to tackle this. And that's actually why New Pluralists was set up as a collaborative. So we're a collaborative of funders who themselves hold very different perspectives about the world, how the world works, how change happens, what even pluralism is, and the idea of saying we're going to walk the talk. So actually all of our funders sign an MOU saying they will abide by the guiding principles of pluralism. We also deeply partner with very different kinds of field practitioners who also represent the very varied ways in which people find themselves in this work. For some, it has to do with peace building and conflict resolution. For some, it has to do with bridge building and social cohesion. For some, it's about immigrant inclusion and welcoming. People who approach this as researchers, as practitioners, as artists, storytellers, that in fact, we actually need all of us to be able to look at this together and to be able to work on it together. So is the opportunity. that actually the vast majority, this is what our research is showing us, the vast majority of people are actually exhausted from this toxic polarization. And as Jay mentioned, it's not so much that the majority of people are very far apart, it's that we are misperceiving our very differences from each other. And we see that as an opportunity for pluralism, that if people are hungry and waiting for another way to be, we can step into that vacuum. And we're also discovering that it's not just 20, 30, 40 different field leaders and organizations that care about this. There are literally thousands of people embedded in communities and organizations across the country that when they hear this, when they hear about these ideas, they can't believe that there's actually something like this that to be able to step into. And I think that's sort of one of the biggest insights that we're drawing in, is that there actually is reason for hope. We just need to step into it and manifest it.
Thank you so much. I am going to close our session by thanking our guests, Uma Viswanathan with New Pluralists, Mark Freeman with the Institute for Integrated Transitions, and Dr. Jay Van Bavel from New York University. Thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you for spending time with us today to help us think about polarization, but also depluralization and pluralism for the benefit of human flourishing. In this session, we have named some of the challenges the world faces today, and we have tried to offer ideas, tools, and skills to help each of us create communities where we all feel safe, free, and fully alive. In other words, communities where all humans can flourish.
Okay, that was a stimulating conversation. I was certainly glued, and I'm sure as you were listening, you could relate some case studies, you could relate the content to some world events that are playing out right now in real time. And we certainly need to be prepared for a polarized world by responding with depolarization and pluralism for flourishing. So thank you so very much. We're going to break from programming now so that you can engage with the more than 80 posters in the abstract hall. It is an impressive collection of research that was submitted in this year's open call for abstracts and selected by an independent jury of leading researchers in the field of flourishing. So many of the authors will be online and present during this time to respond to any questions or comments that you may have in real time. So let's move over there now, navigate back to the main timeline. This is important. You will navigate back to the main timeline and enter the abstract poster showcase, okay? And at 12:55 p.m. Eastern Time, that will be 5:55 p.m. Universal Time, we'll reconvene for the final segment of the conference. I look forward to seeing you then.